We have a lot of debt, and in addition to the debt, we have, relative to the size of our state's economy, a much bigger liability for the pensions that governments owe to retired and retiring public servants, which has to be funded in much the same way as interest on debt has to be paid. And there's been almost no discussion that I'm aware of that debt, nor does it seem to have acted as any kind of restraint on contenders for Saturday's polls' willingness to promise to spend more money, which they would have to borrow.
A lot of the promises in this election around stamp duty reductions, around hawking, around reducing the capacity to generate revenue at, say, Hydro Tasmania, reducing the amount of own source income coming into the state. How significant is that?
Well, it is significant. And again, Treasury warned about the dangers of this in the pre-election fiscal outlook. You know, they said in that the risk to the state's revenue base through the lowering of tax rates, increasing tax-free thresholds and other measures that restrict taxation bases for some revenue lines has increased over time. And they also talked about the risks to the state budget of measures which limit government business returns. Now, that's precisely what the bipartisan policy of, Tasmanian electricity at Tasmanian prices. This is going to deprive the budget of potentially significant amounts of revenue that hydro generates from selling Tasmanian electricity to Victorians at Victorian prices. 96 cents of every dollar that hydro makes in profit is paid into the state budget that helps pay for schools and hospitals and, for that matter, rebates to electricity consumers who genuinely need them, not me, but people on pensions and other low incomes. That's funded in part by the profits that hydro makes that are in turn paid into the budget. Now, neither side of politics who are proposing to cut hydro's profits in order to win votes and to give power away at below market prices to any carpetbagger who comes to Tasmania knocking on hydro's door saying that we'll create a few jobs in exchange for getting power at a lower price than you or I pay for it. None of them have said how that shortfall in hydro's profits is going to be made good.
There are good fats and there are bad fats in our diet. There's good debt that creates productive benefits across the state. And there's bad debt, like your credit card debt. Is the growth in the debt that you can see on the Tasmanian state balance sheet, is it good debt or bad debt?
There are bits of both. I mean, where governments borrow to fund infrastructure projects that will produce benefits for future generations as well as the current one, it's right and proper that future generations be asked to contribute to some of the cost of providing that infrastructure by repaying and servicing debt that's been taken out by this generation. Otherwise, take the Bridgewater Bridge, for example. Is it right that the current generation of taxpayers should pay for something that will benefit the next 100 years? So some debt is appropriate. There's no principle of public finance that says the optimal level of debt for a government is zero, any more than there is for BHP or a company. But a lot of the debt that has been run up over the last 4 years has been to pay recurrent expenses, the salaries of teachers and nurses and public servants and grants to community groups and things like that. And while that might have been necessary temporarily during COVID is receding into history, and yet Treasury is telling us that if you strip out the one-off payments from the Commonwealth Government for capital works programs that under our accounting standards are included as recurrent revenue, then the so-called operating budget, that is, revenues minus recurrent or ongoing expenses, is going to be in deficit at least until 2026-27 and almost certainly for many years afterwards.
So nobody's promising to deliver a surplus, which is normally considered a virtue in a state election?
Well, Labor is saying that they will. I would say it's a bit contemptuous of the people to keep that back until less than 48 hours before they go to vote. This sort of thing should have been out on the table much earlier in the election campaign. And as far as I know, I hope I'm not doing him a disservice, the Treasurer, Mr Ferguson, hasn't said how he's going to pay for the $1.6 billion of promises that the Liberals have made during this election campaign, let alone reverse the deterioration in the budget deficit that was disclosed in the revised estimates report released the afternoon before the election was called. If you also add in, as I mentioned before, our unfunded superannuation liabilities, which are much bigger relative to the size of our economy than of any other state or territory, then Tasmania's non-financial public sector net financial liabilities, mainly debt and super, minus whatever cash governments and their departments and agencies have in the bank, that is going to rise from $15.4 billion at the end of the June 2023 financial year to $23.1 billion by 30 June 2027.
I'd like to ask you this question, and I'm sure a lot of people wondering this. Where does this end? If these are the projections, worsening debt for the state, if we can assume that maybe the GST lucky stick isn't going to hit us in the way it has in the past, how does this story end?
Well, maybe Victoria gives us a glimpse of how it ends, because in the last two budgets, Victorians have been hit with additional taxes, additional land tax, additional payroll tax on businesses. It's essentially either that or it's nasty cuts in government spending. Of course, Tasmania has been here before. I mean, remember Robin Gray's government left Tasmania in a dreadful financial mess. You know, if John Cain and Rob Jolly were the gold medalists for fiscal incompetence during the 1980s, then Robin Gray wasn't far behind with the silver. And people with long memories will remember that the Field government and then Ray Groom's government had to preside over some pretty drastic cutbacks in government spending and some tax increases in order to get that debt that Robin Gray left this state with down to some kind of manageable, reasonable level.
Mornings with Leon Compton on ABC Radio Hobart and ABC Northern Tasmania.